All right. I'll have to share my slide. Someone confirm. You see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, all right. Okay, I know last week we did a little bit introduction, but we won't be continuing that this week. So I'll just go ahead because we stopped somewhere last week, and I will also want us to, get the ground running and go ahead and tackle some certain stuff that we left off last week. And to begin with, I will still kind of go through our agenda, and just like I did last week. Last week we talked about introduction paragraph. We talked about research. We talked about academic writing in its introductory stage, and we went as far as discussing things like sentence structure, especially verbs that you should be using as a result of the resources that you are referencing, or the sources you are citing in your research. And I can also remember we also touch base with paragraph structure and what is expected of you as a researcher or as a graduate student when you are a kind of responding to a prompt or responding to a concept that you want to write about in your essay. Yeah, I think that led us to talk about the definition essay or the definition paper. So this week we'll be discussing extensively sources. And if you can remember, last time we touched a little, we kind of touched base with sources, but I didn't really go into details, talking about it extensively. And I promised I was going to do that in the next session or in the next workshop. So that next session or that next workshop is today. So we are going to discuss sources extensively, and we are also going to talk about how can you, use your sources to make research arguments. How can you argue in your research? How can you, support your claim? How can you use your sources to defend your hypothesis or to defend your claim, So we're also going to see how do you write this? How do you make arguments that answers to your research question? Because every research must have a question, and that your question is probably your claim or your hypothesis. So in the verge of answering that question, you need to be defensive. You also need to kind of propose defensible argument that will not only answer your question, but also make it clearer to your readers that, okay, this is convincing. This is something I can be able to go with you. Because most times in research, people say it's all about argument, critiquing people or trying to a kind of do something other people maybe overlooked or maybe stopped halfway. Then you are kind of trying to extend, or you discovered a knowledge gap and you are trying to close that knowledge gap. There are different angles through which you can approach your research or your essay, and in general, we can say your academic writing. So we can do these things without sources, and that is the difference between creative writing and research writing or academic writing. Because in creative writing, you can just go ahead and tell your stories. But as far as you are writing an academic paper or a research or an article, so to say, you are expected to argue, you are expected to sound convincing. And one of the resources, one of the key things that help you to do these things are sources. So that's why we are starting with sources today. I think that's a good background to today's topic. So sources are making research argument. So in academic or research writing, sources are materials a writer, which we can say a researcher, employs in their essays to defend a claim or hypothesis. So here, like I discussed last week or mentioned, that sources can be, materials. It could also be objects. It can be clothing. It can be letters. It can be, it can be books. It can be novels. It can be something someone else has written. So, newspaper, magazine, novels, periodicals, artifacts, diaries, registers, census documents. These things are sources. Sometimes, sources can also be some objects that may have existed, in a time period. And because it is relevant to your research, you go as far as referencing that object, that particular object in your research. Sources can also be a place, maybe that place is instrumental in your research or in your paper, and you have to visit that place. And when you go there, you will kind of try to cite in your paper that you visited this place and you collected first-hand information. Sources can also be, your an interview, people's experience or people's story, after you must have interviewed them. So that's where we now talk about primary sources and talking about collecting raw data. For those of you who are doing experimental research or who are doing a research that involve human subject as your participants, but we'll still get to that anyway. So sources can be primary, secondary, and tertiary. I think I mentioned this last week, but I'll still go ahead and discuss this extensively. The sources can be primary or secondary, but I didn't talk about tertiary sources, so we'll discuss that today. So primary sources are original materials with raw data that support your hypothesis or help you defend your claim. So when we talk about original materials, we're talking about the thing itself, not something that have been reported, not something that have been written on. So they are just the original material. For example, this phone is an original material, so it can be a source. So a primary source can be novels that have been written by, novelists, for example, Chimamanda Adichie's Americana is a primary source because it is a novel and it is an original material, and you can get the author's raw statement or raw data because you are seeing the story. So this is not a story that is being reported on something you get. So it can be objects like we mentioned before. Some of you who are interested in carrying out a research that maybe you are trying to catalog or trying to do one or two research on African artifacts, and you happen to visit African museums, maybe in Africa or in the Western world, and you were able to kind of cite those objects that you saw there, those artifacts. So they are also primary sources. Then maps. Any map you can see is a primary source, whether an old map or new map, these are primary sources. And some of you are doing some things, some historical research. You can reference maps, to talk about location or where Russia was before it became Russia, stuff like that. Some of the geographical research will also involve maps, and maps will be a primary source. Diaries, census documents. Maybe you are doing something on population and you needed to reference to a particular census, maybe a census that was conducted in Ghana, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Ethiopia, and you really wanted to know, okay, what was the population of this particular area in 2015? So you will depend on the census document, and that census document, if you can be able to access it, it becomes a primary source to you. Then clothing, when I say clothing, it can also be a historical, if you are doing a historical research, for example, those of us who might be interested in the Nigerian Civil War, and you happen to visit, for example, Center for Memories in Enugu, so you find some clothing, of soldiers who fought in the Biafran War. That clothing serves as primary source to you. Before I continue, can someone tell me if they are following?
We are following.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we
We are
are.
following.
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes it looks as if you are talking to yourself, but always know that you are free to, raise your hand or, ask questions at any time. I can always give you that space and opportunity in case there is something you need me to redress. Okay, talking about secondary sources, we said that secondary sources are articles, books, reviews, or it can even be your dissertation or thesis, that interpret and are based on primary sources. So I think what we basically do as graduate students, especially those who will be writing a paper, it doesn't matter whether you're in the humanities or you're in natural science or social science, as far as you're writing an article, and nobody will even believe you if you write everything, from memory, except if you are writing a memoir, or you are keeping a diary, which I don't know who would want to publish that. It can also serve as primary source, but most of the things we do in graduate studies, we kind of reference secondary sources a lot, even while we have primary sources with us. You get, for example, if you're in the liberal arts, I might be interested in doing or writing something on feminism, and I decided to use Chimamanda Adichie's Purple Hibiscus. So that Purple Hibiscus serves as a primary source to me, but there are chances that Chinwe might have, referenced, Chinwe might have written something on, patriarchy or feminism or women's subjugation, and, what Chinwe has written cut across what I'm interested in, or what is found in Chimamanda Adichie's Purple Hibiscus. So Chinwezu's paper becomes a secondary source because Chinwezu's paper reported on the primary source. So I can also leverage Chinwezu's paper, which is a secondary source, in my research. So as a researcher, you go as far as also, using both primary and secondary source, even tertiary source. But when we get to tertiary source, we'll get to know what tertiary source means. So secondary sources are articles like books or reviews. Some of you've heard about peer-reviewed journals. These are journals that accept papers, these are journals where for them to accept your paper for publication, it must go through, proofreading by different, proofreaders, or go through editing by different editors for them to unanimously say, okay, this is worth publishing. So we say that that journal is a peer-reviewed journal. So people also write reviews about a book. So for example, someone wants to write a review on A Man of the People by Chinua Achebe. So, and you just go ahead and write the review and get published. So your review becomes a secondary source because you have written on a primary source, which is a novel called A Man of the People by Chinua Achebe. It can also be your dissertation. Definitely, as master's students who will be doing thesis, if you're on thesis track, or PhD, I don't need to ask whether you're on dissertation track, because for you, sure, I heard that we can also have administrative PhD, people who don't do dissertation. But if you are, doing dissertation, definitely you are going to consult a lot of secondary source in your writing, in your dissertation. So all the works, all the books, all the articles that have that have been written on primary sources, they are known as secondary source. And secondary source are stuff that we are really going to be making use of a lot as writers, as researchers, as graduate students. So they are used for scholarly or professional debate, criticism, or argument. Then talking about tertiary source, tertiary sources are books, articles, or reports. But look at the difference. They synthesize secondary sources. So let's assume Chinwe has written something, a work on African literature, trying to, report on on works of James Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Kofi Awono and Chinua Achebe. Then Ernest Emeagwali has also written something like that, and Charles Nolem has also written something like that. So what tertiary source does is someone, maybe a scholar, comes up and kind of try to synthesize what Chinwe had written and what Emeagwali had written and what Charles Nolem had written, a brief report about it. So what that scholar is writing serves as a tertiary source. But mind you, we always advise, not like I'm kind of trying to scare you away from using tertiary sources, but the thing is, it's always limited. So because it does not go deep into the argument raised by different scholars. It's a kind of synthesizing, okay, this is what Chinwe would say, this is what Emeonu said, this is what Charles Nolim said, but they don't really go deep into your research. And I'm sorry because I'm using liberal studies, but I always expect you, as I'm making you these examples with, let's say, literary critics, you also imagine it in your own field because there are also scholars in your own field. So I don't know scholars in your own field, so I'm using scholars in my field, but there is no difference. So it's just a little difference. And when we get to the point where something can be different, I will also tell you it works differently in this field. But this is just the way it is, almost everywhere when we talk about primary, secondary, or tertiary sources. So we always advise, if you want to have a deep understanding of what a scholar has said, we don't advise that you focus your attention on tertiary source or tertiary sources. Then another way to know what a tertiary source is your literature review in your master's thesis. These are tertiary sources because you are synthesizing what scholars have said. If most of you can remember, maybe in your undergraduate or in your master's, the literature review you write, that part, that I think is chapter 2, you say literature review. Those are secondary sources because we are kind of reporting, synthesizing, making those scholars interact according to paragraph. Maybe if you are following a thematic approach to your literature review, making those authors interact. You get, so that can serve as secondary source because I cannot focus on your literature review to grasp what that paper written by that scholar is really saying. But you can just give me a hint. It can give me a hint that Chinweizu said something like this. But if I am interested in that particular research, I will have to go beyond your literature review. Your literature review can serve as a way to know that, okay, there is an existing work or scholarship where I can leverage my research on, So tertiary sources help you get a feel of what arguments are made on a particular topic. A lot of you use Wikipedia. So when I was doing masters at UNN, one of my professors hated if you tell him that you got an information from Wikipedia, he wouldn't take you serious because he sees Wikipedia as a kind of synthesizing what different scholars have done. Then we also have Psychology Today, where they kind of publish different secondary sources. Can someone ask question or comments before I continue? Sometimes it feels like as if I'm talking to myself, but I want to believe that everyone is following. But I also need that check.
We are following.
Okay, can I ask? Since you want,
Oh, yeah.
okay, so let me ask. Maybe I missed out somewhere. I'd like you to actually differentiate between the tertiary and the second. I don't know. Can you emphasize a bit more on the tertiary sources? I'm
Yeah,
not quite sure I got it.
Yeah, I can do that in a minute or half. Okay, so I said tertiary sources, are articles or papers or let's say articles, let's just keep it there. Articles that report on primary sources. So primary sources, like we mentioned, let me use liberal studies so I don't have to, grapple with words. For example, a novel is written, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And that novel, Things Fall Apart, is a primary source. Then in the future, a critic, like we have our own MS Emeonu, wanted to write about patriarchy or the place of a man and a woman in African society, as African cosmology. And in his paper, he decided to reference Achebe's Things Fall Apart, as well as maybe Ferdinand Oyono's The Old Man and the Medal, another primary.
Admin should mute everybody.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. I think I was muted too. Okay. Okay. Let me. All right. Thank you. I believe everyone can hear me now because I'm unmuted. All right. So let's say at this point now, Ernest Emeonu wrote a work or is writing an article on the place of a man in African society or in African cosmology, and decided to, cite works from Achebe or NS on Ferdinand Oyono's novels. So what Emeono has written, Emeono's article serves as a secondary source because in Emeono's article, his arguments are based on Achebe's work, which Achebe's Things Fall Apart is a primary source. So secondary source reports on primary sources, and that is what we basically do as researchers. Then when we talk about tertiary source, let's assume that, like I said ab initio, Emeono has written something about the place of a man in African cosmology, which his article or his paper is a secondary source. Then Chinweizu also had written something on patriarchy. Let's say it wasn't about the place of a man, but on patriarchy in African society, and also reference his own works, his own primary source, and also other secondary source. Then let's assume another critic known as Charles Nolem approached African cosmology in terms of the man and the spiritual. Then, as a scholar, Carlo Ama, I looked at Emeono's work, looked at Chinweizu's work, and looked at Charles Nolem's work. I felt like writing a report on what Chinweizu, Emeono, and Nolem has said concerning the African cosmology and the place of a man. Whatever thing I write, trying to make these authors interact, that thing becomes a tertiary source. Because whatever I'm writing, I'm not going to be mentioning Achebe. I might mention Achebe, but I will say that Emeono said this about Achebe. So tertiary source is a kind of trying to synthesize different secondary sources. Why a secondary source is reporting on primary source. So it builds on that level. I don't know if it makes sense now. Let me know if it doesn't.
Yeah, it does. So beyond that, it becomes hypertertiary or what?
Yeah.
Imagine a fifth generation reference. Does that become hypertertiary? Is there anything like that? But I understand you actually.
Yeah, I don't know. This is how the limit for me. Maybe
It's
I don't
fine.
know whether
It's fine.
yeah,
It's
whether
fine.
there something
Thank
builds
you.
up on tertiary source.
Thank you. It's
Yeah,
fine.
most often than not, what we always use is primary and secondary. The tertiary is now
Yeah,
is most times inconsequential in our research because nobody
it's fine.
believes you are actually making a defensible argument when you cite secondary source. We see you as an amateur. I'm sorry for saying that in case anyone had used tertiary source. We see you as an amateur that you are lazy.
Yeah,
You don't
you
want
haven't
to
done
read.
in-depth
Thank you.
research.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
haven't done
that's
a
fine.
depth research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Somewhere. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Somewhere.
Yes, good afternoon from Ghana. So please, from what you were saying, I want to cite an example. Let's say if in my literature review, I write this, as cited by Kalu 2024, according to Samuel, so and so. It means that me citing you whilst you quoted Samuel, is that falling in line with the tertiary source?
Yes.
I don't know if my information is clear.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. If you are citing me based on something I wrote about a primary source, and you're also citing another author based on what he wrote about a primary source, and you are making my view and his view interact in a paragraph or in the entire essay, that's a tertiary source.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're
very
welcome.
clear.
Yeah. Okay, I wanted to point this out about differentiating sources, but at the end, you find out that nobody is going to ask you in your paper, hey, this looks like a tertiary source, this looks like a secondary source, this looks like primary source, so it doesn't matter. But I just want you to know, the difference between this. Then look at this thing, depending on what you are writing about or researching, a primary source can be a secondary source, vice versa. So that means a secondary source can also be a primary source. It depends on the angle your study takes. Let me give an example. So Sigmund Freud's essay, three minds dialogue in Hamlet, to be or not to be. This essay doesn't exist. I made it up, sorry. But I know that Sigmund Freud always, his psychoanalysis is about the mind, the subconscious, preconscious, and unconscious, and which are the three levels of the mind. All right, so we're assuming that he wrote an essay like this because this is like a research I'm trying to do to tell people that Hamlet, to be or not to be, is not a soliloquy, rather an interaction between three minds. So Sigmund Freud's essay, Three Minds Dialogue in Hamlet, to be or not to be, will be a primary source if you are studying or writing about Freud. If you are writing about Sigmund Freud, his essay on something like this will be a primary source. If you are writing something on Sigmund Freud, maybe you just want to write about his life and his theory, his psychoanalysis, but it will be a secondary source if you are studying Shakespeare. I don't know if that makes sense. To be or not to be is from Hamlet, written by William Shakespeare. But in this context, this is an essay written by Sigmund Freud. And definitely this essay will be a secondary source because maybe you want to write about Shakespeare. It will be a secondary source because this is not a primary text. That paper is not a primary text to Shakespeare. It's not Shakespeare's Hamlet. Rather, it is something that has been reported on Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is a secondary source. Based on our definition of secondary source, it reports primary source. But if I am doing a research on Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalysis as a person, this essay, which was a secondary source in my study of Shakespeare, becomes a primary source in my study of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. Does that make sense? Silence means it's not well.
It's fine, it's fine.
So in this case, it will also affect the verb you use when you reference the source and its authors. I think we talked about this last week, so I should further here. So using sources in your essay. So once you have identified Visumani, okay, go ahead. All right, let me go ahead on to his space. Once you have identified a source that will be useful in your research, create an annotated bibliography. Yeah, definitely. Most times people think annotated bibliography is not necessary. They don't need it, It's fine, you get, but then let's just go through its importance and why it's really necessary as a researcher you keep it, especially if you're going to write thesis or dissertation. So what do we mean by annotated bibliography? This is the bibliographic information of a book, report, or article you have consulted and will use in your research. So let's assume you found a material that will be instrumental in your research. Just go ahead. You can use Google Doc or you can use Google Sheet and bring out the bibliographic information of the book itself, which will include writing out the name of the author or authors in case it was authored by two or more, people. Writing out the name, then the title. If there is subtitle, then you also write out the subtitle. Then writing out the name of the editor or editors and translators, if any. Then the edition of the work, you write out the edition. If it's 4th edition, 5th edition, 6th edition, just write it out. Mind you, you mustn't follow them in this order. Just you can write out information in any order. This is not citation. You are not citing yet. We are not discussing citation today. But you will need this information in case you have to cite. Sure, definitely you have to cite. But when you get to the point of citing. But we are doing this for a reason. So write out the volume, the issue number, the place published, the publisher, date published, page numbers of articles or chapters consulted. That's the URL information if it's an electronic book or online sources. All right, I need to give people some time to come in. I just wanted to finish up with this. All right, go ahead, Mike or Visumani. You can unmute.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah. I think, what if I depend on an electronic approach by using a software like Mendeley that keeps track of all of what I'm doing? Am I still on track?
By using a software like what?
Mendeley.
Did you say LinkedIn?
No, Mendeley.
Okay, Mendeley. I don't know the software, maybe you can explain to me better.
It's a software that keeps track of all sources that you cite.
Okay.
It generates a bibliography of it.
Okay. Thank you for that question, and I'll address it shortly. Okay, here we use Zotero. You get?
Okay.
And it can also be something like Mendeley. But I don't know. This is personal. I'm not kind of trying to. This is personal for me. I try to dissuade my student from using Zotero because I kind of think you won't learn how to. You won't be a seasoned researcher. I know AI is kind of trying to help us from stress or kind of trying to make work easier for us. But in the learning stage, except if you are already grounded, you know how to keep your sources, cite, how to do the research. You've been a seasoned researcher for many years and you felt like, okay, this thing should just help me. If there's anywhere that the machine or the software fails, you can always correct it because you know the right thing. But in the learning stage, I don't advise students to even use Zotero. Yeah, Zotero, for example, will even bring out the site, will even cite the work for you, and you just have to copy and paste. But have you learned how to cite on your own? I know that we are no longer doing traditional now. Everything, we are now living in a global village and everything is now tech oriented, you get. So my 2 cents is, if you're a seasoned researcher, go ahead, because even if the software makes some mistake or thereabout, you can always fish it out and correct it. But if you're still in the process, like many of us, someone like me, I'm still in the process, you get. I prefer it the other way around. I believe that answers your question. Nothing is wrong with all those software. They have been created or established to kind of help ease the work for us. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I think the technical advice is clear.
Okay.
I'm done with my PhD and I've done a lot of articles, so I understand. I was just asking if, when you go school by school, some school can say, no, you can't use this. But at the university I did my PhD, we are allowed to use those softwares because it makes the work faster.
Yeah. Same here. They also advise the same thing here. But I'm just giving you my own 2 cents personally. If you're still learning how to, but if you're already a seasoned researcher and you know, because machines, softwares, they can also fail us at some point, because new editions come up in this, citation style. But it's good we are on the same page and we've met halfway. Thank you. So you can go ahead and add a paragraph summarizing the part of the article or book chapter you read, which you think will be needed in your research. So I'll give an example. So this is a book, sorry, not a book anyway. This is an article called Eco-Criticism as a Reappraisal of Romanticism, written by Mishra Sandeep. I'm not interested in citing this scholar or this researcher. I just want to create my annotated bibliography. Let's assume I'm using a Word document to create my annotated bibliography. But I went as far as bringing out the name of the journal and the volume, and as well the issue, that's issue 3, and it was published in 2017. And in the journal, this work, Eco-Criticism as a Reappraisal of Romanticism, is found in the 435th page to 441 page of the journal. So I also had to write out the page numbers that the article, takes on the journal. Then this is me kind of trying to summarize not entirely the article, but what would be useful for me in my research. So I go ahead by saying that this paper argues that eco-criticism is a modified version of romanticism. So you can, if you look at the things I quote, anything that I've quoted is coming from, is original to the source, original to the secondary source, to the paper, Eco-Criticism as a Reappraisal of Romanticism. So citing the works of Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, and Coleridge, Sandeep holds that. Then I also had to quote him again and attach the page number, which is page 438. I went ahead to also quote him again. So this quote that I'm bringing out will really be instrumental in my research because I already have a topic in mind and I've already sampled this secondary source as going to be useful in my research. So trying to read some part of the research or trying to read his entire paper, this part will really be instrumental in my argument, will defend my claim, will defend my thesis. So that's why I have kind of cited them here. If I can do this thing on more or on all the sources that I'll be using in my research, I have done 90% of the job. Because most times I tell fellow scholars that writing the paper is the easiest job, but gathering the information that will be required in your paper is the hardest job, like annotated bibliography. And that is why we have software that help you gather these things. But then let's also ask the question, with those software, I don't know, maybe some of this software will still help you and say, okay, since you are looking at this approach in these papers, in this person's paper, we are going to cut out some things for you. But then I will always advise, why not read the paper yourself and bring out, quotations or lift what the scholar have said, which will be instrumental to your research. It can still be a copy and paste something because the paper you are reading might still be an e-version of it. You just have to copy it down. If you are reading a raw, let's say a printed text, you can, go through the stress of typing it out and quote. And tomorrow, if I'm doing my research, it will be easier for me because during my argument, I can always come here and lift what Mishra Sandeep has said. And it will be easy. So imagine I'm making use of 10 secondary sources and maybe 2 primary sources. Then and I happen to do annotated bibliography. When I will start writing my paper, it will be so easy for me to defend my argument with evidence, a lot of evidence and citing the researcher. So that's why we advise for annotated bibliography. But there are those who are really skilled and they don't need annotated bibliography. But then if you are doing dissertation or thesis, you're expected to keep some of this information because it might not really be useful in that. It might be useful in that paper you are kind of writing on. Then definitely it will also be useful in another paper because that's why we say that people have research interest. So you might have eco-criticism as one of your interests or one of your research interests. That means tomorrow, if you're writing another book or another paper, you can always come back to your annotated bibliography, which was useful in a different paper. But because you have enormous sources on this, so you can always come back to it and pick things. So annotated bibliography will not only serve the purpose of a particular research, it will serve the purpose of every type of paper or research or article that you'll be writing that are related to that particular field or area. So that's why we keep this. Then let's look at arguing with your sources, because this is now the main thing. If you are writing a paper, you need to argue. You need to defend your claim, because you start the introductory paragraph like we spoke last week, that you must give us your thesis statement. And then your thesis statement is your argument, is your claim. Then how can you argue this claim? How can you flesh it out in your body paragraph? How can you sound more convincing? And sounding more convincing, trying to argue your point out, trying to convince your readers, involves you using your sources. So how can you argue with your sources? So you must not agree with a source before you can use its data. The sources you gather, whether primary or secondary source, will be for a variety of purposes. Some serve you the purpose of arguing for or against a claim. So most times, what we always do, we either objecting or we either agreeing, So some source can serve as an evidence for you to argue for or against a particular claim. Sources can be to support your hypothesis or provide evidence for your reason. I've been using the word hypothesis. So in case, I want to assume that every one of us know what we mean by hypothesis, but in case a few persons or someone here is a kind of finding the word hypothesis too, will I say, complex. So hypothesis in a nutshell is more like an intelligent guess. I will try to explain it scientifically. I think, for example, let's assume that people have a kind of wondered where does rain come from? We wake up, we see rain falling or something of that nature, we go about our business and it rains, and we are like, people are like, where does this thing come from? So maybe someone happened to say, oh, maybe there is a tank in heaven whereby if it wants to rain, God will just, open the tap and it rains. That's an intelligent guess. That's a hypothesis, but it has not been proven. Then someone else will be like, no, I think it's as a result of heat, because when I boil my water in a kettle or, on the stove, the heat makes the water evaporate. And when it evaporates, the water kind of reduces in let's say in size. So that means since we always have sun, heat on the surface of the earth, so the sun extracts the water up and backs it up as cloud until it also comes down. These are hypotheses. And when they now go as far as carrying out their experiment, they arrive at a particular answer, or they arrive at a particular solution, or at a particular, let's say, law or theory which supports that hypothesis. So that's the way it also happened as researchers in humanities, liberal studies, or science. You always tell people that this is something you think will happen at the end. Then you go as far as a kind of backing it up, backing down your evidence, backing it up with evidence to show that this is actually what you said at the beginning is actually what you have as your result. So that's what we mean by hypothesis. So sometimes we can use claim. What's your thesis? What's your claim? So my claim is that this is the way this thing is. So how can you back it up? So backing it up will require you to argue, and arguing will require you to do that with your sources. But there are 5 questions you should always ask if you are making a research argument. And these 5 questions, if you answer it, you've ended up, answering, or you've ended up backing up your claim, or backing up your hypothesis, or arriving at your thesis. The first thing is to make the claim first. What do you want me to believe? So take these questions as what your reader is asking you, or what the editor is asking you, or what the audience is asking you. What do you want me to believe? What's your point? So when they ask you this question, or when you ask yourself this question, that is when you now make that claim. That is when you make your claim. Your claim can be that any work written about Africa, whether the person is African or not, that work is an African literature. This can be your claim. Then the next question is, why do you say that? Why should I agree? This is what a reader or your audience is asking you. Why should I agree? And that is reasons. So after your claim, you give reason to that claim. Then the next question is, okay, how did you know? How did you come about this? Can you back it up? Which is your evidence? So if you are thinking this way, you are going to have a defensible argument in your research, and nobody can shake you. Definitely, people will shake you in the future. And that is why knowledge keep on, expanding. We keep on advancing in knowledge. Then acknowledgement and response is the next question that your reader will ask you. But what about, so in acknowledgement, they want you to, they want to bring up a contradictory statement or view to your own claim. So most times as a researcher, because you don't read voraciously, because you don't read other sources, you just want an independent knowledge. We don't think of, okay, what about this? What about this that doesn't really agree to my thesis? Because if you don't put in consideration other sources or other views or other perspectives that are not overlapping to yours, your argument will not really be strong. So you need to put into consideration, what about other things that contradict you? And once you're able to address those other contradictory things to your thesis, then you are making a defensible argument. You can now go ahead and use every warrant and tell them this is your logic. So how does that follow? That's the next question they will now ask you. They will look for more reasons. Then the reason why I put reasons is because you don't only use one reason to back up a claim, to support a claim. One reason can serve, but there is every chance that you can use more than one reason to support a claim. So the purpose of this argument is to answer your research question or defend your claim. Then let's now look at this claim and reason. a major support in your research argument is your claim and reason. Because let me go back. Claim and reason are the first two, right? So we are taking them one after the other. You make claim and support it with reasons. It can be one reason or reasons or more than one. That was why I put the S. So you make claim and support it with reasons. Example, this is a claim. An African writer is one who writes about Africa, whether or not they are Africans. You've made a claim. And most times when you make your claim, people will be like, really? People want to know why. Why did you say that? And that is the reason. So your claim comes as a declarative statement, authoritatively. You'll be like, an African writer is one who writes about Africa, whether or not they are African. This is a claim. Then look at the reason now. An African writer is one who writes about Africa, whether or not they are Africans. This is because their works, for the most part, mirror the African people, represent African culture, discuss African issues, and have African characters and names. This is your reason to that claim. And our reason is always, most times, primarily, always start with because. This is like a primary, it can go in any way, but just using because, as your connecting word. So it can be because this is a reason you are giving to this claim. So you make a claim and you support it with reason. There could still be more reasons to this, but because we are kind of trying to learn, so we are limiting our reason to one. So let's talk about reason and evidence. You've made a claim, you've supported it with reason. Then there is the next thing, which is evidence. So now I'm going to talk about reason and evidence. And if we go back to this, we find out that evidence is the next thing. So let's still come back and talk about this. So your reasons are based on evidence. You've made a claim because of this reason, based on this evidence. And in your evidence, this is now where you bring in your examples, you bring in your sources, people you've, read about, maybe Charles Nole, Menes, Meono, Kalwama, who have also written something concerning that particular area. So let's now go. An African writer is one who writes about Africa, whether or not they are Africans. That is your claim. Because of what? Let's go over to reason. This is because their works, for the most part, mirror the African people, represent African culture, discuss African issues, and have African characters and names. Based on what? Yes, you've given me, but based on what? Let's look at it. Chinua Achebe's There Was a Country and Frederick Forsyth's The Biafra Story discuss the unsuccessful attempts of the Biafra people to secede from Nigeria during the Nigerian Civil War. This is your evidence. Because Chinua Achebe is an African. Frederick Forsyth is a British novelist, journalist, or author in general. And Frederick Forsyth is not African. Chinua Achebe is African, but both authors wrote different works, but discussed the same issue. So this is your evidence, which you are basing that reason on. Can someone, tell me whether they are getting this? Yeah, I think this point is important. Yeah, is anyone following? Yeah, somewhere. Anyone can speak. Let me know whether you are with me. If you are with me, at this level.
Yes, with you. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So you've made a claim because of this reason, based on this evidence. So if you want to make a defensible research argument, always think about this question. What is your claim? What do you want me to believe? You've made your claim. Because of what? That is the reason. Then, based on what? This is now where you bring in your sources. In this context now, you see that I have these two books are my primary sources, right? Because Chinua Achebe's There Was a Country is his only memoir, which is his last work. So it's a primary source. Frederick Forsyth's The Biafra Story is also a primary source, right? So you see where I brought in primary source, but you can also bring in secondary source at this point. Like I told you, there is no rule on what follows, the type of source that follows when you want to, bring in your evidence or back up your reason with evidence. Anything can work. Then let's now start from the beginning. So we get to that 5 element of research question. So the claim is an African writer is one who writes about Africa, whether or not they are Africans. The reason is, this is because their works, for the most part, mirror the African people, represent African culture, discuss African issues, and have African characters and names. What are you basing this reason on? Which is the evidence. Chinua Achebe's There Was a Country and Frederick Forsyth's The Biafra Story discuss the unsuccessful attempts of the Biafra people to secede from Nigeria during the Nigeria Civil War. This is the evidence. And this evidence have proven that an African writer is anyone who writes about Africa, whether or not they are Africans. So Frederick Forsyth is not an African, and you can still call him an African writer because he has written a work that mirrors the African people and the African experience, what happened in Nigerian Biafra War. I think his work is the first account of the first eyewitness account of the Biafran story. Yeah, someone you wanted to come in.
Yes, please. So here I want to understand is the claim is your hypothesis. And by presenting the evidence, you use the evidence to test the hypothesis, if I'm right.
Yeah, your evidence can be, okay, on what field are you coming from? Let me know.
Oh, okay. My field is business and education.
Okay. So let's assume you read some article by education scholars on the approach or the way teachers are not being paid very well. At this point now you support it with this evidence, or sorry, you support that your hypothesis with that resource, which that support system you are now giving is your evidence, which is that article you read about on teachers underpayment. Is that clear? I just wanted to use your...
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. So acknowledgement and response. If you can remember what we talked about, acknowledgement and response, like trying to put into consideration other scholars who have said something that might really, fall out from your argument or your thesis. Although Kaluama argued that while Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness is acclaimed to have responded to the dark side of imperialism in Africa, its representation of the African landscape and people are deceitful and nothing but a mendacious propaganda. This acknowledgement and response is not agreeing with your argument. That is why I say that you don't reference a source because everything about that source has to agree with your thesis or your claim. No, you still go as far as picking other sources, other secondary or primary sources that will not agree or that doesn't overlap with your argument, but you need to bring in that consideration. At that point, see what is helping you do. It's helping you clear the air. In case you are, for example, in a conference, you are about going to present this in a conference and making this claim. Somebody already has this objection to make, but whereby you've already introduced the objection and you've also addressed that objection, people will just be like, I almost said that, but you brought it in and you also address it. It saves you time. It makes your argument strong. It makes your argument defensible to acknowledge other things, other sources, other views, other perspectives that will contradict yours. To do that personally, you are building a strong research argument. Okay, for some of you who haven't read Heart of Darkness, I wouldn't even advise you to read. Don't even spend a penny to read it. You don't need to. Joseph Conrad, made a fool of himself, and I can say this anywhere because Achebe said it already. So I'm flying on his wings to say it, that Conrad insulted Africans, stuff like that. So it's no longer in news, or everyone who has read Things Fall Apart shouldn't even. I think I removed it from my departmental library when I was in Nigeria. All right, so someone might argue Kaluama, but I'm not arguing. I'm just using this as a means of learning. So Carlo Amma argued that why Joseph Conrad Heart of Darkness is acclaimed to have responded to the dark side of imperialism in Africa, which is what people want us to believe. Its representation of the African landscape and people are deceitful and nothing but a mendacious propaganda. Yes, this is something I'm arguing. Sorry that I said I'm not arguing this. Like, this is my own personal view, but I've not written this anywhere. This is like an example. But I'm trying to contradict whoever that wants to say that an African writer is one who writes about Africa, whether or not they are Africans. But then you, like the writer of this whole paper, or the writer making this argument, acknowledge that contradictory view to his, and he's now going to address it, and he now started it. However, while Amma might have a point, his argument did not put into consideration that Conrad's Heart of Darkness employs hyperbole as a technique to exaggerate the situation in which the Europeans claimed they found Africa. This way, Conrad's novella is set in Africa, as actions that follow in the work are reflective of the African colonial environment. So imagine you are about presenting this in a conference, and after backing it up with evidence, and I almost stood up to say, no, you can't agree. I can't agree with this because Conrad's Heart of Darkness is you'll be like, hold your horses. Although Carlo Amma, so you're not bringing that contradiction, then you also go ahead as clearing that contradiction or trying to solve that that argument I might already be nursing by asking me to hold my horses. So this is, I know that this is in liberal art, but I just want you to also apply it in your different fields. Make your claim, support it with reason, base it on an evidence. Try to acknowledge other people that may have a contradictory view, because that is what people will be looking at. Did you also think about this? Did you also think about that? So when you do that, then the next thing will now be to address both your claim, reasons, evidence, and the contradictory view by, giving out the logic or now explaining the logic to them. I think any question, comments, I can always leave this slide in case you have questions and comments. I'm sorry I may have rushed it, but I was trying to keep to time, and this is 1 hour now. But questions, comments, everything we've done today is just how you can argue, how you can make a defensible argument, make a defensible research argument as a researcher, as a writer, using your sources. Any question, comment?
Please, sir, are you going to send these slides for these slides?
Yeah, I already sent it to Professor Siri. So the next thing will now be to, when I get the record, the video record, then I also email it to him.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah, Prof. Kalu, please, may I request that if you could share your WhatsApp number with us, if you had already done that in the previous class, that I can't tell, but if we'll be fortunate to have it.
Yeah, I appreciate your concern. I think you can get it from Professor Siri.
No, but if you are fine with that, why not share it with us here? Maybe just drop it on the comments.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Let me stop sharing my screen first. You want to be this. I'm thinking like an old man. I should know how to do this.